Please be seated. Before we begin, I think it fitting that we say a few words and express our condolences and our heartfelt sorrow for the events in Boston yesterday. Regardless of how it came to happen, it was a terrible tragedy, and our prayers go out to the victims and their families, and our thanks to the brave men and women who were first on the scene. America watched yet again an act of terror in horror yesterday at one of the icons of the American sports and recreational scene. We won't soon forget it, and I want to thank all of you for this moment of silence. The committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to fundamentally do two things and do them well. First, because Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, America deserves an efficient, effective government that works for them. The oversight side of our committee's responsibility is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. Our job is to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. With oversight comes reform if it's done right. Today, we're continuing our oversight of, in fact, the first real down payment on reducing the size of government in my 12-plus years on the Hill. Sequestration is, by definition, the worst possible way to save money. Across-the-board cuts make no sense. However, as we now have come to know, within sequestration, within departments, sequestration is not across the board. You don't buy 2.4% less toilet paper. You don't turn lights on 2.4% less bright. The truth is that agencies have had an obligation to make decisions. The decisions, as we will see today and as we have seen in previous hearings, vary widely. Our initial discovery is that independent agencies, not told by Office of Management and Budget to ignore the impending sequestration cuts, for the most part have taken steps, and those steps have consistently meant sequestration was less onerous than it would otherwise be. However, within agencies that were held to make their cuts later rather than sooner, it appears as though there is a wide variety of decision process. It appears to me, at least, that politics of sequestration need to be ended and ended soon. Americans deserve to know that we, in fact, can reduce the size of government. We can make decisions that impact Americans less or not at all. As we will hear today, some made decisions that, in fact, mean a win-win, not the least of which is an example of simply shipping answers or mailing more efficiently. Seems like a small thing, but it's a small thing that came from the necessity to cut a budget. Having come from the private sector, these kinds of boom and bust occur within the economic cycle regularly. Almost every company has a hot season and an off season, years that are better and years that, in fact, they need to be more efficient, times in which market share is being gained at all cost, and times at which, within a given amount of market share, the stockholders would like you to make a little more profit. This does not occur ordinarily within government. Perhaps for the first time since the end of World War II, our government is facing a clamor from the stockholders, the American people, to make fundamental changes in how much we spend and to do it wisely. That's one of the reasons that I think there was such a strong reaction to the White House canceling tours due to sequestration. There are many things that the White House could have canceled. There are many decisions they could have made. This one appears to be symbolic and political. Now, the fact is, something did have to be cut. Changes had to be made. And we will hear today, among others, from the Park Service, who has a great deal of control over Camp David and the White House, in addition to the monuments throughout Washington and, of course, our beloved parks around the country, including my personal favorite, Yellowstone. Director Jarvis has been very public about his perceptions and the effects of sequestration. In public statements, he has fed fears that trash will not be picked up, that bathrooms won't be cleaned, and that access roads to national parks won't be plowed. However, there is an inconsistency in what Director Jarvis has said publicly and what the Park Service has told us when they briefed the committee just last week. We hope to reconcile these differences because, in fact, they are profound. The Budget Office representative from the Park Service told both Democratic and Republican committee staff that 99% of visitors will not even notice adjustments. I would notice if there were no toilet paper. I would notice if the road were unplowed. This is far departure from Director Jarvis's public statements prior to today, and I am hoping that we can clear up the ambiguity between his previous statements and the briefings we received on a bipartisan basis from his staff. But it goes far beyond this. The fundamental question is, can we do better with less? In the case of the Park Service, in constant dollars, they still have 5% more money today than they had when President Obama took office. Yes, there were plus-ups for the period of time of the stimulus. But the truth is, when looking at their major budget representing 87% of their total expenditures, in other words, the non-capital budget, we find that in constant dollars they have more money today than they had in 2008. And in 2008, quite frankly, Mr. Jarvis, the roads were plowed, the trash was taken out, and most of the time there was toilet paper. Early this year, the committee sent letters to the Department of Interior asking just the kinds of questions that Congress needs to know. How can Congress help change the most difficult sequester cuts facing agencies like the Park Service instead of and across the board? To date, including today, we have still not received an answer to that question, meaning the Park Service has not asked us for any authority that would help reduce sequestration. We can only presume that their position is we need all the money we've had, including the 5% increase in our operating budget since 2008, or we will have to make these cuts. That doesn't make sense. There has to be a few percent better way to spend money. We will also hear today from witnesses representing the National Archives and the Smithsonian. I understand they are not planning to furlough employees and have been far less vocal discussing the possibilities of public inconvenience caused by the sequester than the Park Service. At the end of the day, this hearing is about how we can best work together to ensure the American people are not adversely impacted by outcomes that can be avoided by planning, coordination, and managing. And with that, I recognize the Ranking Member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I address the topic of today's hearing, I want to take a moment to express our deepest sympathies to the victims of yesterday's bombings at the Boston Marathon. As I did on the floor yesterday, yesterday was and I talked about yesterday was a holiday in Boston, Patriots Day, and what was supposed to be a celebration turned into a horrible tragedy for these victims and for their families. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. I also want to commend our first responders, many of them Federal government employees, State employees, local employees, emergency medical teams, health care providers, and especially the law enforcement officials at the local, State, and Federal levels who no doubt will be working on this case in the days and weeks to come. And as we all glued our eyes to the television sets, we heard over and over again of the many instances where so many Americans who were there were told to stay away, but they made decisions to go and help their neighbors. And that's what America is all about. In our toughest times, we have a way of showing the best of ourselves. And so that leads me to today's hearing. To Mr. Ferrero, to Mr. Jarvis and Mr. Clough, I'm going to start off with the presumption that I trust you. I trust that you are in jobs that are very difficult. I trust that you did not come to these positions to do harm to the public, but to help the public live a life that's well-seasoned, to have experiences that will live with them till they die. You don't walk into these offices that you hold trying to stop the public from having the kind of opportunities that they deserve. And I refuse to believe that. I just don't. All my dealings with public employees, and I've said it on the floor of the House and I'll say it again, most people who come to government service that I know of come because they have a commitment to lifting up the public, whether they be at NIH, whether they be in the Park Service, whether they be on our staffs. People on both sides sometimes are sitting up to 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, sending emails, looking over records. Why? Because they want to do something good for the public. And I believe that that's what you all are about. And I'm begging you, I would ask you, but I'm begging you to make that clear today. I don't know, we all make mistakes. We all have to sometimes change our plans. Sequestration, I'm sure, has caused a lot to happen for all your folks. But from what I can see, you all started planning early, trying to make the right decisions. And in many instances, you're faced with situations where you'd cut. But again, and I will say this over and over again, cuts have consequences. They have consequences. I don't care where they are, unless you just got a pile of money that's just floating down from the sky. There are going to be some consequences. It's either going to hit you today or you're going to hit you later. Or it's going to be seen here or it's going to be seen there. Or it may not be felt right now, but it'll be felt at some point. But they do have consequences. So there are two things. One, I trust you. I trust that you're trying to make the right decisions. I'm not starting with the presumption that you're trying to screw the public. I'm not starting with that. Number two, I'm assuming that you will show us what you did when you first heard about sequestration, the acts you took, and tell us not just about what you're doing right now, but what you see up the road. This is a long road. The cuts are going to continue. So all of us want our constituents to be served well, as I know that you do. And so today the committee is holding its second hearing on how federal agencies are implementing massive across-the-board cuts imposed by sequestration. I fully support this hearing because Congress needs to understand how these indiscriminate cuts are negatively affecting our constituents. The committee has called 3 agencies to testify: the National Park Service, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Archives and Records Administration. All 3 agencies have a significant presence here in Washington, and all 3 are suffering from the negative effects of sequestration. As I understand it, the National Park Service plans to furlough all 767 Park Police employees. It may continue its hiring freeze, which has left about 900 positions vacant, and it expects about 3/4 of its cuts to be taken from facility maintenance, visitor service, park protection, and resource stewardship. Somebody's got to pay. Something's got to give. It may delay road openings, deploy fewer park patrols. Obviously, if you got to furlough people, there's going to be some folks who are not present. and close entire facilities such as campgrounds and visitor centers. The Smithsonian may have to take similar measures, including reducing guard forces at its facilities. It may reduce or close certain exhibits, galleries, or museums, and it may postpone maintenance and defer capital projects. It also may delay the opening of the new National Museum of African American History and Culture by cutting funds to hire critical staff. The National Archives also may have to eliminate exhibits and public programs, reduce hours for researchers, and cut contracts to preserve paper and electronic records. It also may be forced to reduce public access to records, including records sought by veterans and their families to verify eligibility for Federal benefits to which they are entitled. At our last hearing, we discussed how Speaker Boehner and the House Republicans insisted on these massive cuts in exchange for averting default on the national debt. They considered this a political victory. Today, although Republican leaders take credit for these cuts, they do not take responsibility for their negative effects. Some critics argue that the Federal agencies could avoid these negative consequences simply by transferring funds from different accounts or by selectively cutting only certain programs. They even suggest that agencies might be making cuts unnecessarily to inflate their negative impact for political reasons. As we learned in our previous hearing, however, Congress did not give agencies wide discretion to implement sequestration. Congress imposed these across-the-board cuts at every programmatic level, and Congress has passed multiple restrictions to prevent agencies from transferring or pre-programming funds. Critics seem unable and unwilling to acknowledge this one simple fact: these massive cuts do have consequences. And finally, Mr. Chairman, serious negative and harmful consequences for the American people. Anyone who blames the President for closures and cutbacks in Washington, D.C., whether at the White House or at the three agencies here today, is either unfair or misinformed. I would like to put up some photos, if I may. These are pictures of office buildings right here in the Capitol. Republican leaders drastically cut funds for the Capitol Police this year. So office buildings throughout Congress have been forced to shut their doors. Lines for the general public now spiral into the street, and I'm sure almost every congressional staffer in this room has been affected by this as well. Is this somehow the President's fault? Of course it's not. Cuts have consequences. The sooner we recognize that, the sooner we can begin working with Federal agencies to protect them and the American public from these mindless across-the-board cuts. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would note that that picture could have been taken 5 years ago. It's not uncommon to have those kinds of lines at that point.
Chairman, I appreciate what you just said. The picture was taken this morning.
I have little doubt of that.
Okay.
Members may have members may have 7 days to submit opening statements or enter extraneous material into the record. We will now welcome our guest. The Honorable David Ferraro is the archivist of the National Archives and Records Administration and a returning guest. The Honorable Jonathan Jarvis is the Director of the Park Service and, again, returning. And Dr. Wayne Clough is it Clough, right? Clough. Dr. Wayne Clough is the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and I will endeavor to not get that wrong again. Thank you all for your service. Pursuant to the committee rules, all witnesses will rise and be sworn. Please raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate please have a seat. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. As is the custom here on the Hill, I would ask that your entire opening statements will be placed in the record. I would ask that you limit your opening statement, which some of you are bound to read whether we ask you not to or not, or a summary thereof. But please try to stay as close to the lights in front of you And as now my retired predecessor used to say, it's easy to remember. It's just like a street light. Yellow means go real fast so you don't end up on red. And with that, Mr. Ferraro.
Let me begin by thanking both of you for acknowledging yesterday's events. Having crossed that finish line 7 times myself and had friends and relatives at the finish line, this was a very personal attack for me.
I notice you're not giving us your times, though.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummins, and distinguished members of the committee, thanks for inviting me to testify this morning on the impact of sequestration on the National Archives and Records Administration. Our mission is to store, preserve, and provide public access to the permanently valuable records of the Federal Government. We provide agencies with records management services and temporary record storage. In total, NARA holds 33 million cubic feet of permanent and temporary records in more than 40 facilities across the United States, including the presidential libraries of 13 former presidents. NARA performed its mission through its workforce of approximately 3,300 employees and an annual appropriated budget of $391 million. We serve the public by providing access to records that help Americans of all ages to better understand their history and their democracy, document their rights of citizens, and allow Americans to hold their government accountable. Last year alone, NARA responded to over 1 million requests from American veterans and their families seeking documentation of military service, which is necessary to qualify for health benefits, military burials, and the replacement of medals. We support government accountability by ensuring public access to records that document and explain government decisions. We publish the Daily Federal Register, operate the National Declassification Center, and improve the administration of FOIA through the Office of Government Information Services. And although we care for billions of pages, we are perhaps best known for displaying the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Over 3 million people visit NARA exhibits nationwide every year. Sequestration has reduced NARA's budget to $371 million, or $19.7 million below the amounts provided in fiscal year 2013. All but $1 million of this reduction must come out of NARA's operating expense budget appropriations. Because sequestration occurred with only 7 months remaining in fiscal year 2013, our sequestration amount is equivalent to a 7.7% reduction in available funds for the remainder of the fiscal year. Our primary objectives for implementing sequestration cuts are to preserve the agency mission and to minimize disruptions in agency services to the public. We identified specific cuts to contracts, grants, and other spending consistent with these principles. Our plan relies in part on budgetary savings from an agency-wide hiring freeze. NARA's workforce has shrunk by 299 employees, or 8.5% of the workforce, since the hiring freeze was implemented in November of 2011. Sequestration has required that we reduce public hours at 2 of our largest facilities, the buildings in Washington, D.C. and College Park, Maryland. Research rooms in both facilities are normally open 6 days a week from 9 to 5, with extended hours to 9 p.m. on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. Due to sequestration, NARA will no longer offer extended hours, but the research rooms will remain open from 9 to 5 Monday through Saturday year-round. The museum in Washington, D.C. has been impacted by sequestration. In the past, NARA's extended public hours for the museum until 7 p.m. from March 15th through Labor Day. Due to sequestration, NARA will no longer offer these extended hours, but the museum will remain open from 10 to 5:30, 7 days a week, year-round. We decided to reduce public hours after reviewing attendance data that showed extended hours were underutilized by the public and that they extended beyond the visitor hours of comparable museums and institutions. NARA's decision to reduce public hours at 2 facilities is only a small part of a much larger and more detrimental impact of sequestration on NARA's mission and operations. Sequestration will require NARA to defer preservation actions necessary to protect low and moderate risk records from deterioration and will delay efforts to conserve film, audio, and other special media. We will also reduce spending on the Electronic Records Archive and will not be able to address concerns raised by ERA users and other Federal agencies and by NARA's Inspector General. We will reduce spending on maintenance of 17 buildings that NARA owns and will defer all building repairs except where necessary to protect the safety of building occupants, visitors, and the records we hold in trust. NARA has prepared a responsible plan that implements fiscal 2013 sequestration cuts in a way that preserves the agency mission and minimizes the impact on the public to the greatest possible extent. Much as NARA's sequestration cuts have been taken from administrative and support functions, however, sequestration imposes significant budget reductions on NARA that cannot be fully implemented without some noticeable impact on service to the public. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my formal statement. I look forward to continuing the discussion with you and members of the committee.
Thank you. I do too. Before we begin questions of Director Jarvis, I want to note this committee sent you on March 27th a request for documents. The committee is used to receiving documents in a timely fashion. Our request for documents from the National Park Service on how you are managing sequestration. The date to respond was April 10, 2013, and no written official response has been received. When it became clear the Park Service was not going to meet its deadline, committee staff posed just 5 simple questions to your legislative affair representative, which place them on the board. They really are pretty simple to answer. The questions were completely ignored for 2 days until an in-person staff briefing on April 12th. At that briefing, the Congressional Affairs representative attempted to provide vague answers to the questions, and when pressed by staff, promised email answers to these questions. 4 days later, we still have not received answers to these questions. Director Jarvis, although I will permit you to testify, your lack of transparency and, frankly, your obstruction as to the internal activities of the Park Service relative to sequestration is troubling. We put deadlines that were reasonable and attainable, and for reasons we cannot understand, you have deliberately thwarted our oversight. Last Congress, getting answers from the DOI after repeatedly requesting them was like pulling teeth. This is an unacceptable pattern of behavior. Director Jarvis, we already have your written statement in the record, and as we on the dais have had an opportunity to read it, instead we ask you to summarize your testimony and to use all or part of your 5 minutes to answer these 5 simple questions. When did the Department of and National Park Service begin collecting information responsive to the Chairman's letter? How many staff does Department of Interior or National Park Service are involved in search for responsive materials? Who are the individuals at the Department and or the National Park Service conducting the search? What search items are being used to find responsive materials, and how many responsive documents have you identified so far? I don't believe these are unreasonable questions, considering you have not been able to deliver us any responsive documents. I ask you to at least answer the questions, and you have staff behind you that we know it, about why you are here at a hearing testifying on clear inconsistencies between your own staff's briefing and your public statements. This is not a surprise to you. I might note, as you begin your testimony, that a little over 400 parks received this one-page questionnaire. It simply asked for simple numbers and then a comment line. It was a pretty good idea, a one-page question to 400 plus of your superintendents to get a basic idea of where they thought there were savings and perhaps collate them. I don't have any question that they are all sitting on one desk in your offices. I also have a whistleblower who tells me that in some of these documents they said, we have no problem, we can do it. We will not have to be absent toilet paper. We had a right to see these documents before you came. We had a right to know, the American people had a right to know, that over 400 different parks and monuments had differing problems, differing opinions on what they could do to save money. We were denied that, and we know they are sitting on a desk They're assembled, and they simply were not delivered to this committee. It is your right to collect documents and look at them. It is not your right to provide delay. And when you look at 400 pieces of paper, the time necessary would be less for your staff than it took you to get over here this morning. And with that, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, may I be heard, please?
Of course.
Thank you. Let me say that, Mr. Jarvis, I certainly agree with the Chairman with regard to any kind of effort and failure to provide us with the information that we request. I have said many times that I believe that this committee should be operated almost like a Federal court, with high standards and fairness. I am concerned, too, that we have not gotten this information. I would agree with the Chairman that the 5 questions that were just listed, you need to answer. I would also, I am concerned that requests were made for information which, you know, I don't know what kind of difficulty you all ran into, but it's my understanding from staff that your folks said that they were gathering the information or had gotten the information together, but their general counsel had to go through it. I think you need to make it clear. I mean, we won't want to. But we've got to move forward, Mr. Jarvis, and I think it's so important that we maintain the trust that I talked about a little bit earlier. Whenever there is a lack of trust, relationships fail. I don't give it what kind of relationship it is. And so I note from Chairman Eisner's letter of March 27th, he made these are the things that he was concerned about. He wanted a list of names and titles of individuals at NPS who submitted, solicited, collected, or evaluated proposals related to the NPS's budget modifications resulting from sequestration. He wanted all documents that refer to or instruct the National Park Service on the process which proposals for budget modifications are to be handled at NPS due to sequestration. He wanted all copies of each budget modification and how they were solicited and evaluated, and he wanted all documents and communications, including handwritten notes referring to or relating to the National Park Service plans to budget adjustments under sequestration. I do not think that those things, those requests are unreasonable. I know the Chairman has said that he wants you to limit your response to the 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman, I would ask that if he can give, if it need be, given 2 extra minutes or 3 extra minutes to address this, because this is very serious, Mr. Jarvis. As I said from the very beginning, I trust you guys. I trust that you're doing the right thing for the public. But you have to make sure that there is the greatest degree of transparency. And if counsel is your lawyers are going through the papers, you know, sometimes the lawyers got to work late. They got to bend over backwards to get it done. But we have to move forward. And so, Mr. Chairman, again, I would ask that if he need a few minutes to answer your concerns, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
With the indulgence of the other witnesses, without objection so ordered, please continue.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to talk about sequestration within the National Park Service. You know, I will summarize my opening remarks so that we can get to the questions. The sequestration really required the Park Service to reduce its spending by $153 million, of which $113 million was taken directly from the National Park Service operational account. Remaining $40 million kind of came from projects and grants. And I think the key point here is that the National Park Service's budget is park by park, so that the 5% sequestration was applied at each individual park and program. Now, over the last 3 years, we have been on a slight decline. So we began our planning exercise for this sequestration actually in the middle of 2012. And we instructed every park, every program, and every organization to really develop a financial model to handle what we thought would be a very tough coming fiscal year in 2013. We asked them to leave vacant positions unfilled, plan for fewer seasonal hires, and reduce short-term spending. We applied that strategy across the entire organization, preparing for fiscal 2013. When it appeared that the sequestration was going to occur, I implemented a hiring freeze on all permanent positions. That resulted in 1,300 positions that remained vacant, and we are holding 900 of those to remain vacant through the rest of the fiscal year. That resulted in about $43 million in savings in 2013. I instructed them next to eliminate spending on travel, overtime, supplies and materials, and contracts. We've had strict travel controls in place since 2003, and that resulted in an additional savings. I can give you those numbers. Those that were unable to meet their sequestration targets after that were then asked to reduce the numbers of seasonals, to extend furloughs, to subject to furloughs, and lastly, that if they can't meet their sequestration targets by then, they needed to look at furloughing permanent employees, all of them for the same amount of time. As a result of all of these, I think, very conservative efforts, the only part of our organization that is going to result in actual furloughs of permanent employees is the U.S. Park Police, because they are predominantly a salary, non-grant, non-construction side of our house. These reductions definitely are having impacts. Reduced hours of operations, later and delayed road openings, fewer programs, fewer services. Every park and activity will have some kind of impact, and we think those impacts will accumulate over time. So actually, I think we have approached this very conservatively. We do not want to impact the public, so our focus has been principally on the shoulder seasons of our national parks. Keep in mind, this sequestration came mid-year, and we are going into our peak season. So what we had to do is to reduce the hours and operations around the edges of the prime season so that the principal visitors would not be impacted during our prime summer season as well. We gave each individual park the opportunity to make choices about how they could implement it, and then we reviewed all of those products that you saw, Mr. Chairman, back at the park at the Washington level to ensure there was consistency in how it was applied across the system, and to make sure that the numbers that they were providing actually made sense for this service. Let me just say one thing in light of the very, very tragic attack in Boston yesterday. As you well know, the National Park Service, through its U.S. Park Police and our other law enforcement organizations, participate in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I can assure you that these sequestration impacts are not compromising our responsibilities for ICON security here in Washington or in our other sites around the country, in Statue of Liberty or the Golden Gate Bridge or other sites as well. So, getting to your questions. The first one, when did the Department and the NPS begin collecting information? On April 8th, the National Park Service was forwarded your letter, and we began immediately to collect that information in response to your request. In terms of how many staff in the Department of Interior and the National Park Service, we have 5 employees in the Washington office that are working directly on the responsiveness. We task at our regional level. We have 7 regions, and there are staff at each of those 7 regions collecting specifically the information, and I'm aware of there are 9 individuals working at the Department of the Interior in responding to your request. Essentially within my staff, which I can speak to specifically, is my Chief of Staff, who has the responsibility of responding to all of these types of congressional requests to collect this information and have it reviewed. In terms of search terms, we draw directly from your request. We use, I can't tell you off the top of my head what those terms are, but specifically we want to be comprehensive. So, using just sequestration isn't really going to get it. We really look at all of the planning and documents. That results, frankly, in thousands of pages. And And I want to be clear that the General Counsel and solicitors do not work for the National Park Service. They work for the Department of the Interior. They require their review of these documents before they are sent. I have no control over that whatsoever, and that is the standard that the Department of Interior is applying, that these have to be reviewed by them before they are submitted.
Thank you. Doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee for this opportunity to testify. The Smithsonian appreciates the support of the Administration, Congress, and the American people. Spring brings the cherry blossoms, tourists, and school children to our nation's capital. I love to see the buses pull up in front of our museums and galleries and watch all those visitors pull out with smiles on their faces, knowing they're going in for a great learning experience at the Smithsonian. Our mission is to make the resources of the Smithsonian available to all Americans and help our country address critical challenges through programs in education, the humanities, and sciences. With the help of our 17-member Board of Regents, which includes 6 members of Congress, we've embraced a culture of change to create a more responsive and relevant Smithsonian. Last year, our 19 museums and galleries and the National Zoo opened nearly 100 new exhibitions and hosted more than 30 million visitors, the highest number in the last decade, and up 5 million from 2007. We're open 364 days a year, and admission is free. We're expanding our reach through digital access with more than 100 million unique visitors to our websites. With more than 2,000 online lesson plans and courses that meet state standards, we are now delivering Smithsonian content to schools in all 50 states. About 60% of our art collections are now available online. The foundation for all of our work is based on impeccable research, scholarship in art, science, history, culture, and education. Every day, more than 500 Smithsonian scientists are working on some of the most perplexing problems we face: protecting our imperiled natural resources, keeping our ports and waterways safe from invasive species, halting the spread of pandemic diseases, saving endangered species, keeping commercial and military aircraft safe from bird strikes, and helping guide Curiosity, the Mars rover. We are stewards of America's collections, some of which date back even before the founding of the Smithsonian. They include 137 million objects and treasures, from a tiny fossil, a giant squid, the Star-Spangled Banner, the desk upon which Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, Harriet Tubman's shawl, the Wright Flyer, and the Space Shuttle Discovery. I'm honored to lead a dedicated staff of 6,400 employees plus 6,200 volunteers who are all passionate about their work. And that's why, for the 3rd year in a row, the Smithsonian was named as one of the top 4 best places to work in the Federal Government. Guided by our 2010 strategic plan, we measure everything we do to ensure we are continuously improving. There are great opportunities ahead, but there is no question sequestration will have an impact on our ability to serve the American people. We did our best to anticipate sequestration, and so as the fiscal year began, the Smithsonian acted, recognizing that the reduction of our Federal budget of 5% would amount to nearly $42 million. Over time, we restricted staff travel, cut funds for collections, care, and research equipment, and our Latino pool and our collections information system and facilities maintenance. We reduced investments for research, education, and outreach, and imposed a hiring freeze and did not backfill critical curatorial and staff positions. We did this to ensure we had funding to allow us to bridge the early impact of sequestration. Although holding these funds back has affected our basic operations, it allowed us to continue to serve the American people in the short term, keeping our museums open and continuing to deliver all the educational materials we had promised. However, we now see the full impact of sequestration, and we will face hard decisions for 2014. We have little budget flexibility remaining. Sequestration will affect almost everything we do. We expect to have to close some of the galleries in our museums through the end of this fiscal year. We will reduce the ability to offer new exhibitions and programs for next year. It certainly will impact our research capacity. It will slow the process of digitization, which we're very excited about for the future of the Smithsonian. It will defer needed maintenance and hamper educational outreach. Previous actions that we undertaken this year will become permanent with a prolonged sequester and will translate into permanent staff reduction. The sequester will also affect our budget in areas that we believe are already underfunded, such as facilities maintenance and collections care. Sequestration also could affect the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Interrupting its funding for construction could increase its cost in later phases and might delay acquiring the right numbers of personnel to open the museum. For 167 years, the Smithsonian has served our nation as a source of inspiration and discovery. Our goal is to create a Smithsonian for the 21st century that gives all Americans a chance to benefit from this remarkable institution. I grew up in a rural town of 5,000 people in South Georgia, Douglas, Georgia. I paid my way through college working as a surveyor for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company. I didn't discover the Smithsonian until I was an adult. When I came here nearly 5 years ago, I challenged our people to reach out to the underserved people of America, and we've been doing just that. But the sequester is going to limit our progress and make it more difficult to achieve that particular goal. Again, I thank you for your support, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for first round. First of all, Mr. Ferraro, Dr. Clough, I appreciate the fact that you were able to reach sequestration, and I appreciate both of the detail you've given us in writing and now some orally on the cuts. I'd like to share with you something just so you know that we do feel your pain on this side of the dais. In 2011, Congress, the House specifically, cut our budgets in real dollars. This is not constant dollars. We cut 5% over the previous year. 2012, the Speaker reiterated, and we cut 6.4%. This year, the budget decrease on my staff, on the ranking member's staff, 10%. We're 21.4% less than we were in 2010, and those are written dollars. Obviously, due to inflation, it's a greater amount than that. And the ranking member is right. We have had to make some decisions, and I don't make light of it. We've also, I hope, begun the process of asking, can we be smarter? Here in the House, for 11 years, I asked, why is it we're using a phone system that isn't voice over IP? Why do we, in fact, buy countless lines that normally go down when somebody decides to attack our phones by endlessly calling because they don't like some piece of legislation? And the answer was, well, we'll get to it. Well, now that they figured it could pay for itself in less than 3 years, we're getting to it quicker. So necessity is the mother of invention. Doctor, in your case, I believe, if I understood your statement, many of the ways that you achieved this year's sequestration was, in fact, unsustainable going forward, that without material changes in revenue, perhaps philanthropic revenue, without potentially taking a 100% free museum and charging an entrance, or without cutting services, currently you forecast that you will have to make actual cuts in service. Is that a summation?
Our goal, obviously, is to try to keep our museums open because the American people come here, some plan for a lifetime to make their visits here, and we recognize the importance of our services there. We are going through a process now that will allow us to understand and appreciate exactly how we can accommodate these cuts in the long run.
Yeah, and I would reiterate our offer that if we receive an adjustment request from any fund, from any part of government, I've agreed to author it and send it up for consideration in the House immediately. And that would include, in order to maintain the schedule on the African American portion of your new portion that's under construction, you figure out how we should reallocate funds, and I personally will author it. I'm sure the ranking member will be my co-sponsor, so at least you get immediate consideration. Ferraro, I think yours is a great example where there are services that are being prioritized lower, but in fact, you began this process quite a bit earlier. Was that really what gave you the advantage, perhaps, over the Park Service, is when you began making, for example, hiring freezes?
I'm sure that put us in a good position. It forced the agency to analyze every opening and make a decision. Is there a smarter way to do the work? Is the work core mission work? And created a kind of urgency within the agency around reduced reduced funds.
Mr. Jarvis, you said earlier that you began process of polling, figuring out where money could be saved, but that was actually not for sequestration. That was just for the 2013 budget. Isn't it true that it wasn't until January 5th or 25th, many, many days after sequestration was clearly the law of the land, that you then sent out the request for information from your 400? This is actually, again, I know it's not you. It says the United States Department of Interior, but it does say National Park Service underneath. And it was sent with your signature, and that is the 25th of January, to regional directors, associate and assistant directors of the Park Service. And I understand that's the one that generated this one-page request. Isn't that true? Isn't that when you polled people to say to 400-plus locations, how can we save money?
Mr. Chairman, our first memo to the field regarding anticipation of a very, very conservative fiscal year actually went out in June of 2012.
No, I understand, but sequestration appears to have, and I'm going to quote from your own letter, "This memorandum and the attached materials outline the actions you are directed to take to develop a sequestration plan in response to the Administration and Congress." Now, I don't know any other way to say it, but you haven't given us any evidence that you did something before that, and my time is very limited. I don't want to run any further over, and there will be a second round of questioning, but my only question to you at this moment is, why is it when on January 25th you send it out, in March we request these documents specifically, that 400 or so of these documents, one page long, shouldn't be given to us as turned in? In other words, make a Xerox copy for yourself, but since we have a right to see it as it was turned in, what lawyer has any right not to turn those 400-plus documents over to us? And I want that answered because we're used to getting what we call rolling discovery on this committee. We get the easy stuff first, we get the slightly harder to collate second, and we get the stuff the lawyers have to go over endlessly. Usually we call that the embarrassing stuff last. In this case, if these are embarrassing, they're certainly not hard to gather. You have them all in a single stack on somebody's desk, and they're pretty straightforward. They're a one-pager directly from people you trust. And in your opening statement, you said you wanted to sort of, I don't have your quote, but you wanted to essentially make sure they were all the same. These documents, from what we can tell, are the best source of finding out where 1 out of 400 people had a great idea, and you should send out to the other 399 or 400 and some, hey, what about so-and-so that this Park Service came up with in their memo answer? We can't know what that says until you deliver those documents that, quite frankly, if you made a look over your shoulder to one of your assistants, we could have before the end of this hearing. And with that, I yield to the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman's status parliamentary
At
inquiry.
what point in the proceedings would it be appropriate if I was to offer a motion to subpoena those 400 documents for the committee? Would it be appropriate?
It is now being heard, but I would consider at this hearing that that motion would probably not come to be in order, or if so, it would be suspended till the end.
Well, I'd be prepared when it is appropriate and at what hearing to offer that motion. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the ranking member.
Just another part of my time, just further parliamentary inquiry.
Of course.
Mr. Chairman, as you well know, we do everything in our power to try to avoid subpoenas. And one of my
including here.
Yeah, and one of my questions was going to be, and I heard Mr. Jarvis say that Counsel for the Interior controls things. I'm trying to figure out how we can expedite that and get the records. I know you don't have apparently in control. And maybe that's a discussion that would come up with regard to the motion, but it just seems like there's somebody we should be looking at in the council to get the stuff done. Because as I understand it, the records are ready to roll, right? So,
yeah, and I agree with the gentleman that we're shooting the messenger some, But I recognize that within the hierarchy of the administration, it's not exclusively within your jurisdiction. So I think the gentleman's right, and the gentleman recognizes.
Thank you very much.
Would the gentleman yield on this? Would the gentleman yield for more?
Sure. I didn't know I had time, but
He has all the time in the
Well,
world.
I thought that you had recognized the ranking member.
Yeah, but the gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Well, I just want to say that I came in a little bit late when you were going over this data or lack of getting this data. I just want to say, as a chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, this is a pattern that I see very, very prevalent in Department of Interior, just asking for documents. So it's very frustrating to me and for the ranking member. How you get this is, I mean, it should be information that should be shared with us. Yeah. I have a deep sense of frustration when I talk to my oversight people, and I see that shared with you. And hopefully we can shake that loose here. But
well, it's my hope, and I said this earlier, that we will shake that loose. Yeah. And I said to Mr. Jarvis that I agree with the chairman that there are documents that we must have, and that they must take reasonable actions to make sure we get those documents. Because you're using that around to hear this statement that I make, right. But we got a limited amount of time here.
Exactly.
And we've got to be effective and efficient. And if they are blocking us from being effective and efficient, then we got to do what we got to do to make sure we can be that.
Well, and I noted in Mr. Jarvis's response, he had the information, but apparently there was somebody in the higher ranks. Right. And I understand there has to be some review. Don't misunderstand. But boy, that seems to be very prevalent with the Department of Interior from my point of view. So I thank the gentleman for the recognition.
Thank you. The gentleman is recognized for his round of questions.
Thank you very much. To all of you all, I want to thank you for your testimony. To Mr. Clough, you provided me with a moment of an emotional moment, actually, because you were talking about trying to make sure you realized that people came to Washington and maybe they had planned the trip for so long. And sometimes Mr. Clough, I sit out in front of the Smithsonian or in front of a park in this area, and I watch the families. And the reason why I said it's emotional for me is that although I live in Baltimore, the first time I went to a Smithsonian institution, I was 21 years old. So I know what you're talking about when you say people plan these trips and they really, and the mothers and fathers are excited. They've talked about it. They've read books about it. The kids are pumped up. And that leads me to my question and what I started with earlier. I assume that you all really want the public to enjoy those experiences. You know, I tell people that people in my district, although they live 40 miles away, they're in the same position that I am. Some of them are 18, 19, 20 years old and never even been to D.C. Never been to the District of Columbia, and they're 40 miles away. They don't even know about some of the parks and the things that you offer. They don't even know about them. But when they come with their families and their eyes are open to what this nation is all about, it gives them a vision of what they can be. So I'm assuming that you all feel the same way I feel, that you want these families, just like you would want for your own family, to have the maximum exposure to whatever you are offering, Park Service, whatever, Smithsonian, that they can have. Is that a fair question? I mean, is that true? Briefly, Mr. Clough?
Absolutely. And the American people, in essence, have already paid for the Smithsonian. They paid for the building, in large part, and they paid for the collection. And so we're thrilled when they make that all-important visit to come to our museums, and we want to maximize it. Now, one way we are trying to connect with people is digitally, is that we can reach everybody digitally. And a lot of young people who may not think initially about museums use these digital devices. So we're developing a lot of mobile apps to get people encouraged to think about the Smithsonian. We encourage them to communicate with us. In the past, they couldn't do that. But with these mobile devices, they can communicate with us. And when they come, they can tell us whether they liked or didn't like their visit, or we need to work on it. So we're really working hard to try to communicate, and after people leave, to provide them with supplemental materials about what they saw, and to particularly provide it their teachers so the teachers can wrap that into the bigger experience. But clearly, every person who visits the Smithsonian walks away with this one thing in mind. I've seen something very special that I've may only see once in my lifetime, and that's maybe the most important thing we've done.
So, and I assume that you two gentlemen feel the same way. Is that accurate? Don't be brief, because I got another question. Mr. Jarvis?
Certainly, that is our mission, to provide these extraordinary locations, over 400 of them, to not only the American public, but to the entire world. That's what we do, and we do it well.
And we collect and protect the records of the country so that the American public can hold their government accountable for their actions. And we also believe in civic literacy, and civics is not being taught in schools anymore. We have a huge responsibility to educate the K-12 community about how their government works.
To me, the question I'm about to ask you is the question of the day. So listen carefully. I believe you. I believe that your mission is to bring life to life for the American people. I believe that you think about it 24/7. You're trying to figure it out. So when sequestration came about, first of all, did you get some commands from up high saying, close this, don't close that, close this? Did you, and how were these decisions made? And this is the question. How were the decisions made in relationship to what the appropriators told you to do under sequestration? What limitations did you have? That's what we need to know. Because you know what? I'm sitting up here and I'm thinking, you know, maybe we ought to be apologizing to you all. We're the ones that are responsible for sequestration. We are, because of what we didn't do. So anyway, would you answer my question one by one?
I think the particular challenge with sequestration was, even though we had an understanding this would happen, was the short period of time in which we have to implement it. So there is this immediate response that we've tried to develop that will allow us to minimize the impact on the public. And as we are moving in our next stage, we're looking at how we deal with this in the long term and taking, again, the guiding principle, let's try to protect the public's interest in doing that.
And is that guided by our legislative, I mean, what we've done here in Washington, up here, Congress? Sequestration, that is.
Well, unfortunately, sequestration is an across-the-board
Right.
cut, and so that makes it difficult to—
Mr. Jarvis, I only have a few minutes, 2 minutes, I think.
Well, first of all, we received no commands from on high about how to implement this. We did this from the bottom up, from the park level. The decisions were made at the park level, but we did review them for consistency. And to your question about, yes, the way that the sequestration law was written, what required us to take it at the park program level, we were not given reprogramming authority. We were not given transfer authority. So we were not allowed to move money around to balance this out. So it was a very, very difficult law to implement halfway through the year as well, across the board, line by line budget reduction.
4 appropriation categories, 5% for each, and OMB directives gave guidance around other things to be looking at, like travel, conferences, and those kinds of activities. We were very lucky early in my administration to have hired a new Chief Financial Officer. So from the very beginning of my assuming my job, we've been giving new fiscal attention to the National Archives budget. So I'm very thankful for this new Chief Financial Officer's advice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, and I'll recognize myself for a round of questions. This may not be the highlight of the hearings held on Capitol Hill today. Nonetheless, it's very important. The 3 individuals before us have some of the most important responsibilities, I believe, in our government, and that's that you're the stewards of our national treasures, whether it's Mr. Jarvis with our parks and the things that he oversees that we're stewards of the public. The Smithsonian director, some of our treasures and our records and documents, the archives. You have several different examples of how we've had to address responsible financial commitments. The Congress has to deal with issues, huge issues of incredible public indebtedness, and everyone knew some of this is coming. You have two excellent examples as to how this was handled fairly appropriately. I think the archives did an excellent job in the review of the documents. Preparing, they knew. The Smithsonian likewise limited the impact, but planned in advance. Disturbed to read that the National Park Service, and specifically the acting parks director, gave specific instructions. I've got some of the language to continue the spending sort of unabated, not planning for the future. You're aware of that directive, Mr. Jarvis?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, sir.
Well, it's an OMB directive, and it was John. Well, also we have in January of January 25th of 2013, the park director, that's you, said you expect will result in reduction to visitors' service hours of operation, shortening of reasons, and possible closing of areas. That was your statement back then. And then we have a directive from OMB, July 31st of 2012, and the acting director, Jeffrey Zentz, instructed agencies to continue normal spending and operations since more than 5 months remain for Congress to act. So you have the administration directing you, and again, your lack of taking any anticipatory action and your statement in January. You have two agencies that did act in a proper manner, and now we're faced with, and I thought I heard you say, too, you're going to cut Park Service police. Did you have numbers there?
Yes, sir. We anticipate, since we had to absorb a $5 million, $5.1 million cut in the U.S. Park Police operating budget, that we are anticipating furloughing each of the 767 employees of the U.S. Park Police for us up to 14 days.
Now, given the events of the last 24 hours, you think you'll also continue with that directive?
We are going to ensure that our responsibilities, particularly for ICON security, are maintained at current levels. That will require reductions in some of our outlying
How many people work at the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., in not just, I'm talking about the office, administrative personnel?
I'm not sure of that. No.
Anyone have an idea? 500, 1,000?
No. Can I ask for a clarification on the question? You said how many administrative?
Yeah, again, not National Park Service officers, but how many administrative people, how many in your headquarters? Nobody has a clue?
How many administrators? What's the Washington office? About 900 here in Washington.
And it would appear to me, if you had the authority, that some of these people could be moved around and that we could address some of the services that we provide to the public, including important security service. Would that be possible if you had that authority?
What we would need, and we've talked about this before, is we need transfer authority. The sequestration law did not allow us to move expenses between accounts. And so it came down, as we've said, line by line existing budget. The only way we could do that, where if you affected one program and used it in another, was if we had transfer authority.
The other thing, too, is that when you face a situation like this, you have to implement some measures. And I've visited many of the parks across the nation. I have one of the little passes and all of that. But I've always been impressed with the volunteer programs. And there are hundreds of thousands of volunteers that would step up if asked. Has there been a specific plan to implement the use of volunteers given the budget challenges that you face?
Absolutely. We have an incredible group of volunteers out there, about 180,000 volunteers.
But you don't, have you had a new plan since you've heard about these budget cuts, and could you provide the committee with a copy?
We have not implemented any new plan at the park level. At each individual park level, they are working to find new sources of funding. Friends groups are stepping up, philanthropy, even in some cases communities are providing support and funding. Some cases states are stepping up to provide assistance in getting roads open.
And finally, there may be some suggestions from some of those parks in those 400 documents that you sent out. When do you think we'll be able to get those? Any idea?
As soon as they are reviewed at the Department. I have no problem with sending them to you. They're perfectly legitimate details.
Well, I have additional questions we'll submit for the record. I'll recognize Ms. Norton.
It would be Mr. Davis's time if he would yield to me Emancipation Day for right.
Okay, Mr. Davis, your time. Mr. Davis.
I appreciate that very much.
Ms. Norton.
It's Emancipation Day in the district, and they're about to embark on a parade. The least emancipated city in the United States is about to march in an Emancipation Day parade. Take that and see what you can do with it. Let me just quickly go through a few questions. Dr. Clow, you indicated, of course, and some of the questions you've heard from my colleagues apparently don't always digest or process the notion that these are across-the-board cuts. You indicated that there might be some slowdown in the African American Museum. I want to know, what was the President's budget for the African American Museum? How much was it cut, if it was?
There was a cut of about $5 million. The percentage was taken direct because it was across-the-board cut out of the construction budget. And fortunately, the budget was funded at $75 million this year. So we can keep the project going. But as we have to absorb additional cuts, then that could present a problem for us.
What about Sequester? Has that affected the African American Museum?
That was the Sequester cut.
I see.
It affects the construction cost. It also affects the staffing funding that we need, because the staffing has to grow now to get ready for the open.
Yeah. I recognize that as we ask all of you questions, and I'm interested in all three of your agencies, because this is, of course, a tourist destination, and we are in the middle of as that season is beginning full-fledged now. I also recognize that each of these agencies is, like most of the Federal Government, labor-intensive. Mr. Jarvis, I know a lot about the underfunding of the Capitol Police and of the Park Service, because you own most of the parks in the District of Columbia, and because of my work on the mall. I was amazed to find, though, is this figure correct, that the National Park Service budget is only 1/14 of the Federal budget?
I don't know what percentage we are. I know it's very small.
Well, I wish you would confirm or not that, because my office says that that's what it is. Well, that would be, of course, quite amazing, considering that it's a nationwide service. Do the parks produce economic return as 1/14 of the budget? What kind of economic return do you produce for the country?
It's a 10-to-1 return. For every dollar invested in the National Park Service, there's $10 returned to the American economy.
I understand. I'm already receiving calls, for example, because there was a story run about closing some of the late night hours at the mall. And I said, well, what is late night hour? And apparently, because of the beauty of the Lincoln Memorial and the lights, we have had that memorial open with some staff there, including restrooms, until 11:30. And then we're told, well, it might be 10 o'clock. I must say, if you're sitting where I'm sitting and seeing the cut you're making, that might not seem so bad, because at least it could go until night, and people could see the Lincoln Memorial and the mall and all of its nighttime glory. Are you considering closing? Are you considering reducing the hours of the restrooms and of the late time, the nighttime visitation to the mall? And is it true that this is not related to sequestration?
Let me assure you that the monuments memorials are open 24 hours a day. The question is whether or not they are staffed for rangers to do interpretive programs. And as with any organization, we're constantly looking for efficiencies. And at the lowest period, we realize that after 10 p.m., visitation drops, not to zero, but it drops significantly. And so as a part of our cost savings, we are looking at reducing the ranger presence, not security, and not closing the facilities, but after 10 p.m.
How about the National Mall? This is the time of the year when we have major events on the National Mall. Of course, I note what has just happened in Boston. Nevertheless, you must be preparing for events like July 4th. We ourselves have National Dance Day on the mall. There are many activities on the mall precisely because of the season. What are you doing to, especially in light of what happened yesterday, to enhance the security of the mall in light of sequestration and cuts that you say will also come to the Capitol Police?
Well, we host a number of events on this mall. Obviously, the 4th of July, Rolling Thunder. Certainly this year we have the March on Washington. These are very, very important events for the American public, certainly for the district. We intend to hold them all. And obviously, our responsibilities for public safety and security and good experience for everyone is at the top of our responsibilities. That does mean, though, that, for instance, the 4th of July costs the National Park Service over $1 million for that one day operating budget, for overtime, for security, screening, for traffic control, all of those things. That means we still have to absorb that cut somewhere else. And that's basically what we're looking at in terms of reducing overall overtime for our U.S. Park Police, looking at how we can reduce in some of the outlying areas so that we can cover these major events.
Mr. Chairman, I certainly hope some members will join me in asking that the Congress look again, in light of the Boston tragedy, at the cuts that are occurring to public safety as a result of this sequestration, because these events must go on. And I am not convinced that with these services and these police agencies not able to move around money, that we will have in place the same kind of security that we have enjoyed in the past.
Thank the gentlelady. I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for taking our questions and responding today. I guess in light of what has been talked about this morning and some comments made, I think we need to go back in history a little bit and remember that when the President offered the sequester as an alternative to dealing with the budget deficit and debt that we all should have known was there, he undoubtedly thought that the House majority wasn't serious about the deficit or the debt. When he signed it, he probably thought it would never go into effect. I mean, the thought of across the board, where we cut good programs along with unnecessary programs without any real discretion. However, I think the three of you and others at the front line of leading very important functions that our citizens expect to see and that their tax dollars pay for, I being one, Mr. Jarvis, who started out my university career majoring in forestry and land management, love the outdoors. My favorite place on earth is Glacier National Park. I'll be in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park here in just a few short weeks. So understand the taxpayer loves these places and should be afforded their opportunity. But you must have been worried as you looked at it and said, well, they can be political and they can do their fighting in Washington, but ultimately it comes down to what we have to do for the projects that we have, the departments, the functions we have, and the citizens we serve. Did any of you make contact with the administration through whatever sources you have available to you and what chain of command you have? Did any of you make contact with the administration to call for caution and reality in dealing with other ways of approaching our budget concerns and still keeping the functions in place that you see as priority? Any of you can go first.
I did not.
Mr. Jarvis?
Our contacts were principally with the Office of Management and Budget as we were implementing the sequester order or planning for it. We had been planning for this well in advance, and we were making them as aware as possible that they were going to have direct impacts on the ground in every one of the national parks.
We had no direct contact other than the normal OMB processes.
Let me follow this up then. In that, Mr. Jarvis, you indicated you made contact and others through OMB to some degree. But it doesn't sound like a great amount of intensity was put toward this issue. Mr. Jarvis, you referred to the sequester cuts as sudden and significant in your full testimony. Can you explain to me how something that has been on the horizon since August of 2011 qualifies as sudden?
What I mean by sudden is that we anticipated the sequester in January. The later in the fiscal year that we get the sequester, the more difficult it is for an operational agency like the National Park Service. So we, in spite of what is being stated here, we anticipated this and planned well in advance. Otherwise, we wouldn't have 1,300 permanent vacancies and saved ourselves $43 million. That is actually what is saving the public appreciation and use of the parks, is that we're able to hire seasonals and backfill that this coming summer for its prime operation. So we had anticipated it. We just didn't know when it was going to come. And coming this late in the year makes it much more difficult to absorb in the last remaining months.
Well, we had an idea of when it was going to come by the date that it was set initially for certain and then pushed off. Also, the issue of significant. When the American taxpayers had to tighten their budgets significantly over the past number of years, including our House budgets, committee and individual staff offices, a 5% cut, no matter how mindless that is when it's across the board, compared to a 7.4% higher level of funding for your department since 2008. I say there has to be better ways of dealing with the increased dollars, preparing for the sequester, but also, as I started earlier, if there was great concern about this, it boggles my mind that there was an intense pressure put on the administration to say, you know something, Congress just might let sequestration happen. This is the impact it will have. we can't suffer it. A question that I would ask, and I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman, but I will submit it for the record of asking direct questions on how Congress can help each of you in your responsibilities to achieve further efficiencies and save more of the American taxpayers' money. And maybe in the second round of questions I can add to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
They can answer. We've been giving everybody a few minutes if you want to quickly respond.
I appreciate that. Then let me make it the question again. What can Congress do to help you achieve further efficiencies and save more of the American taxpayers' money?
For the National Park Service, because of the way our budget is crafted, which is park by park, we would need what is known as transfer authority.
I have that written down. Okay. What else?
We have one thing I want to mention is that the National Park Service will be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2016. We do have a legislative package that we are submitting through our authorizing committees that would grant additional authorities for philanthropy, for cooperative agreements, to work with our private sector partners in a much more entrepreneurial and innovative way to bring that side to the operation and financial health of the organization. And we'd be glad to work with you on that.
The other two witnesses want to quickly respond.
I would just say that it would help us. I've been in the nonprofit sector as an executive for a long time, president of a university. We need stability. It would be helpful for us to have more stability and a long-range view of the budget so we can plan. It's difficult to plan now because things are not as stable as they would.
Well, I would suggest you talk to the Senate about that. I agree with you. Stability is important. Mr. Ferriero.
This committee has done some great work in marking up PRA, Presidential Records Act, Federal Records Act legislation, and I would encourage pushing that forward. That would be a great help to us.
Thank you. And we'll turn now to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
Thank you very much. So just to put this in a little context, it seems to me what we're dealing with here is a massive act of legislative malpractice and then an attempt to blame it on the people that have to deal with the consequences on that. And that happens when you go around ideologically trying to convince the American people that every dime spent in tax money is wasted or in fraud or abuse, and then go around exclaiming that you want to make cuts but don't have the political courage to actually determine where the cuts are going to be. And certainly nobody here should be under the illusion that Congress abdicated its authority and gave the President discretion of where to cut, because if they had a full appreciation of the sequestration law and its reference back to earlier iterations, they would know that, as you have already discussed, every program, project, and activity has to suffer the cuts. So these are the consequences of that malpractice that people should have known. I suspect many of them didn't know what they were doing in that regard. And so we all should be concerned that that's what's going on, and we should not be looking to all of you to lay blame as to the way you implemented it. Your hands were tied, just as those people that were interested in pushing on the sequestration tied their own hands behind their back, laid down on the rails, and screamed when the train came on that basis. So looking forward, I've got some real concerns. If this stays in, and it sounds like my colleagues are all excited about having sequestration stay in fact, so this mindless, arbitrary cuts will continue on that basis, what is it going to do for the national park's impact on local communities' economic well-being? Mr. Jarvis, in my community alone, we have a number of groups that work regularly with the Park Service, and it really enhances the economy of that district all the way up and down the coast, all the way into from the Atlantic Ocean to the Merrimack River, and it's very important for them. So what do you envision for the future if these cuts stay in effect? What is the Park Service going to have to do as it goes forward? I mean, I'm suspecting that you can't have the seasonal hirings backfilling for the other as a future plan of how you're going to react, right?
No, sir. These cuts, if they remain, really creates a significant problem for the National Park Service. The impacts will accumulate, particularly to the gateway communities. Many of our gateway communities, as you well know, their economies are based on the tourism that come to our national parks. They basically succeed based on their shoulder seasons. So many of these operations can't survive on a 3-month. They need a 5-month season. And as a consequence, we're having to reduce in those shoulder seasons In talking to our Hospitality Association, they are concerned that people are not booking. They're already seeing a reduction in bookings as the result of the American public feeling that the parks are not going to be available to them or services will be reduced. So I think this is a significant problem over the long term for us if the sequester reductions do apply. And I just want to make one very strong point that the National Park Service is, as with my colleagues here, these are investments that need to be made that have reaped great benefit to the American public. We draw international visitors from around the world. We provide extraordinary experiences for the American public, and we return 10 to 1 to the economy.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm as frustrated as you and others that this mindless sort of approach to things would be taken on that basis. Congress could have given the President the authority to do this in a way that it was flexible, which he then could have passed on to all of you folks. But of course, they chose not to give up their authority in that regard. But they also chose not to take their responsibility in identifying where they thought all of this waste, fraud, and abuse was, identify it, and then give you a plan going forward. So, Mr. Clough, let me ask you, the Smithsonian, I understand right now, plans to defer preventative maintenance, facility inspections, technology upgrades. Is that correct?
Right.
So how long can you continue to defer those costs under this plan without some really significant damage to what it is you see as your mission?
Well, it's a cumulative toll, and in time it gets worse and worse. We nominally, by industry standards, should get about $100 million a year given our facilities base. A lot of it historic, and we're open every day of the year but one, so it's heavily used, and we have to keep our energy supplies going almost continuously because we have collections, valuable collections in the museum. And we should nominally have about $100 million a year. We've been running about 75, and Sequester is going to cut that down now by probably another $5 million, and that obviously cumulatively will take its toll. Now, what we try to do is to examine each and every case. We have a priority list and try to attack that priority list each and every year that we can when we're doing our work.
Do you term all of that waste, fraud, and abuse? Is that the way you think spending that money is?
Well, we don't obviously see that as waste, fraud, and abuse. I would say that we are working hard to use technology to increase our productivity. I talk a lot about digitization at the Smithsonian as creating access, which it does. But it also, as we digitize our collections, it's less wear and tear on the collections. For example, we have lots of reenactors who love to come see our Civil War uniforms. If we can show them a great digital image and they don't need to actually hold in their hands the real thing, it cuts down on wear and tear in the collection. So we're trying to invest in new technologies to help us address some of these problems.
Hasn't the Inspector General given you some pretty good recommendations on how to improve your maintenance and preservation of all your collections?
Yeah, we have a very good Inspector General, and we pay very close attention to the recommendations from the Inspector General. In some cases, they recommend things that they believe will reduce cost, but in some cases their recommendations actually increase cost. They go to a collection center and find that we don't have up-to-date cabinets, for example. It costs us money to put those cabinets in. And so from time to time, the Inspector General's recommendations actually increase our cost. But we pay very close attention to their recommendations.
And what's going to be the practical implications to the Smithsonian if you're not able to implement their recommendations?
Well, we hope we will continue to do our very best to meet those recommendations. And we have a Board of Regents, and we discuss these issues with our Board of Regents very carefully. 6 members of Congress are on our board, and we take these recommendations very seriously.
Thank you, gentlemen. And recognize now the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Benevolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, is there ever a case where a program has more than enough funding? Is there? That's what I thought. How about, I understand that the National Park Service, Mr. Jarvis, spent $7 million on bonuses to employees in 2011. Did the National Park Service issue bonuses in 2012?
Not yet. We have reconsidered all bonuses and have put them through a second review, looking at only those that are required by law.
Okay, is there criteria for giving bonuses? Is that readily available for me to review or for the
Yes.
committee to look at?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Could you provide the committee with information on where I can find that? And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
No further questions, then let's see who we got. Ms. Spear?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our representatives from Archives and National Park Service, and I'm going blank on the third one. You know, I'm kind of perplexed by this conversation today, because if the American people don't want to increase their taxes, that's their choice. And then there's a shrinking in the services that we provide. Now, to Dr. Clough, in terms of the Smithsonian, it's an extraordinary gift to the American people. And in many respects, I think postponing deferred maintenance is a problem, and it should be something that you think long and hard before you forego that. But have we come to a point in time where offering the Smithsonian free to everyone is something we can afford? The museum charges $25 a person. Have you explored whether or not charging $5 a person, children free, would be something that would augment your budget significantly?
We've talked a lot about that. I think my general philosophy, and I'll tell you that first, and then I want to indicate that my Board of Regents are very much in support of keeping the admission free to the Smithsonian, is the American people paid for the buildings, they paid for the collections, and it really, I don't think they should have to pay a third time to get into the museum. If you look at the demographics of the people coming to the Smithsonian, many of them do not have a lot of money. I walk the mall, I stand in front of the museums, and I watch the folks go in. Many of them don't even buy food in our museums. They go back outside and they eat their lunches outside. And there's a great joy in their ability to go into one museum and then go into the next museum without having to worry about the admissions cost. Admissions, if you want to apply them, cost to collect. And there would be an initial big bump in cost, actually, to put in the equipment, to put in the people, to put in the time, to put in the accounting, the oversight, all associated with admission.
All right. If that's where you are, and I respect that, then if the American people are saying no to more taxes, shrink government, then we've got to comply with that, and you need to decide where you're going to shrink in terms of the Smithsonian. Mr. Ferrero, did I pronounce that right, Ferriero?
Ferriero.
I have had the opportunity to visit the National Archives on a number of occasions, and it is an extraordinary experience. There's no question about it. Again, we've got to live within our means. I mean, it's something that we're just going to have to do. In terms of providing crucial services to our veterans, documentation so they can get their medals replaced or apply for disability services, whatever it may be, that's critical. That's a function that I think you absolutely have to perform. Now, have you costed out first of all, do you charge for that? And if you don't charge for it, what does it cost per request?
We have transactional data on what it costs per request. I don't have that at my fingertips. Maybe someone in back of me does. $30 per request.
And do you presently charge for that?
We do charge. We do charge for that.
Enough to cover the cost?
It covers the cost. That's right.
All right. Okay, that's good to know.
And it is our #1 service. The Veteran Service is the #1 service that the National Archives provides.
Mr. Jarvis, in terms of the National Park Service, I agree that it is an extraordinary treasure that we have. What do you charge now?
Well, we charge a variety of different rates depending on the park size. They range from $5 to $20. So we collect about $160 million a year in fees.
Is it true that if you're a senior citizen, you can buy a pass for your lifetime for a certain amount of money?
That's correct.
And how much is that?
$10.
All right. I think we need to look at that. $10 for your lifetime at the age of 65? A lot of people at 65 that can pay a little more than $10 for the rest of their life. I yield back.
Let's see, gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. DeCharlet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. You all have important positions, and I guess part of the reason we're here today is to understand sequester and the effects it's having on you. I think it's important to look and acknowledge that we as a country have a major debt problem and we have a major spending problem. Can you all agree with that? If this was the situation you were in your own home, you would probably think you need to make cuts somewhere. Would that be correct? Everyone agrees? Okay, so sequester was not the perfect outcome. We all know that. But I think everyone agrees that we have to do something to get our debt and deficit spending under control. And because of the failure of the super committee, here we are. We have these cuts called sequester. And it's the responsible thing to do to reduce your debt and deficit. Would you all agree with that? Okay. So, Mr. Jarvis, do you think that even though it's the responsible thing to do you feel, let me just ask you outright, do you feel that maybe you over-exaggerated the effects or the consequences of sequester?
No, sir.
So you think that everything you said was right in line as it should have been in terms of you doing your fair share to help get rid of some of this debt and deficit? You feel like your actions were appropriate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In January memo, you wrote that the sequester will result in reductions to visitor services, hours of operation, shortening of park seasons, and possibly closing park areas. Yet in March, you told the Hill there will be no park closures. We're not closing, that you're not closing down. So which is it?
Those are two different things.
Okay.
I said, and I stand by it, that we are not closing any national park units. There are no national parks that are closing. What we're doing is reducing the operating hours, reducing services at some of them, and reducing the ranger-led programs as well as maintenance. So you really have two options. You can close parks, and to take a $113 million cut, we could close maybe 70 to 100 smaller parks, or we could close all parks in the system for up to a month, or you spread the impact across all units. You really have only those options. And so we chose to spread the impact across all units, reducing services but not actually closing any individual park.
Okay. In your testimony today, you stated NPS excluded from furloughs positions that are required to ensure the health and safety of visitors. Yet you also said that due to sequestration, if there's an emergency, it might be slower to get our folks out of there. So why are you saying emergency response times might be slower while you're also saying you're not furloughing health and safety personnel?
Well, we are not furloughing health and safety employees, but we did not hire 900 permanent positions, which includes some of our law enforcement and EMS and firefighting employees, as well as we're not hiring 1,000 seasonals. Our seasonal operation is the lifeblood of the field rangers that are out there responding in the summer. If I don't have as many employees on the ground, that is going to have a direct result in response time.
Okay. So do you worry about the safety of visitors then because of sequestration?
I always worry about the safety of our visitors.
Okay. I'm assuming then you've asked Congress for the ability to reprogram search and rescue funds?
We have requested through our OMB that we have some reprogramming and transfer authority, but we have not received it.
I thought the question about bonuses was very interesting as well. It's something that the private sector doesn't fully understand, how the law requires the Federal Government to pay more, and I'll be interested to see what exactly that is. You said in your testimony that finding long-term efficiencies within park-based budgets is challenging and that NPS strive to eliminate contracted services that could be deferred within minimal short-term repercussions. But since August 2011, when the President signed legislation that mandated sequestration, NPS entered into 45 advertising contracts totaling more than $5 million. you're aware that the President signed legislation August of 2011 mandating sequestration, correct?
Yes, though the sequester wasn't implemented until March of this year.
Okay, but you knew it was signed. You were just hoping for the best that it wouldn't happen?
I really don't know what you're talking about.
Why did you enter into more than $5 million in advertising contracts, including a $58,000 contract for a solar-powered message board, knowing that this might be coming?
I am unaware of those contracts. I don't really, I don't know what you would be referring to in terms of advertising contracts. We don't purchase advertising.
Okay. You said that sequester would result in such things like trash not getting collected, restrooms not being cleaned, toilet paper being out, road not being plowed, less interpreters on the ground. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And those things that those are things that people would notice, wouldn't they?
There probably will be some notice of that, yes.
Okay. Well, you're aware that your budget staff told committee staff that they were not sure 99% of visitors would even notice the cuts?
I think what they're referring to is that in the peak season, which is really the middle of the summer, that most visitors would not notice because that's what we've done. It's the shoulder seasons when the visitation is significantly lower that there would be notice of those impacts.
Okay. I just think it's important when we do something responsible as a country, even if sequestration is not the perfect way to do it, that using messaging to basically scare people into thinking that doing something responsible has to be painful is really unnecessary. And I know that you don't think you did that. Some of this evidence would point otherwise. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, gentlemen, for coming and sharing with us this morning. The executive order for implementing the sequester was issued in late March. Federal agencies are now beginning to implement across-the-board cuts required by statutory language and determine how precisely the cuts will impact their mission and the public. It appears to me that many agencies, including those before us today, planned for the possibility of cuts since last year. I'd like to better understand what went into those planning efforts and how they are assisting the agencies accommodate the cuts required by sequestration. Mr. Jarvis, for example, I understand that prior to sequestration and in anticipation of tightening budgets, the Park Service began a process of trimming expenditures at parks and other units last year. For example, your agency implemented a hiring freeze on permanent positions, which left vacant a number of staff positions going forward, allowing you to accrue about 1,300 funded vacancies. It is my understanding that you plan to leave about 900 of those positions unfilled, which will save your agency about $43.5 million through the end of the fiscal year. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Those figures are correct.
I also understand that in anticipation of forced cuts, you also eliminated some lower priority support costs such as travel, overtime pay, merit awards, supplies, and contracted services to save money. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Were there any other planning actions that you implemented or plan to implement as we go through the sequestration?
Well, we are deferring anything to the next fiscal year that we can as well. We are looking at, in terms of our deployment of employees, to make sure that they are deployed to the highest visitor use areas. We are building our philanthropic side of our organization, the National Park Foundation, the legislatively created foundation here to raise funds to provide assistance. We are looking to partner with our other sister agencies, the other Federal and State agencies, to ensure that facilities can be open. For instance, at Badlands National Park, we are working with the State there to ensure that highway road stop that also serves a small visitor center for the park would remain open. So across the system, we are looking for volunteers, local assistance, shared use agreements, and all of those to ensure that we provide quality service to the public.
Thank you. Mr. Fiera, I understand that your agency also began planning for the possibility of cuts early as last year. For example, I understand that you imposed a hiring freeze beginning in November of 2012, which reduced your workforce by 300 employees. How much did you save by that action?
That 300 employees translated into about $9 million.
I also understand that your agency canceled certain non-mission essential conferences, reduced travel budgets, and attempted to pre-identify approximately $20 million in cuts to contracts, grants, and other non-labor expenditures that could be implemented if the sequestration came about. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Quickly, Secretary Clough, similar to the other two agencies, I understand that your agency also implemented a hiring freeze and began other efforts to defer some maintenance activities.
That's correct. I should point out that when I came to the Smithsonian and looked at the statistics for the last 10 years, it became obvious to me that over time the Smithsonian lost about 600 Federal positions against the cost of inflation. So we began thinking about how to do business more efficiently. In addition, because there were concerns about possible budget cuts in the last few years, we developed a menu of opportunities, or places, I should say, where we would adapt to these kinds of cuts. So we've been thinking about this for a long time. So we're implementing something that we've been thinking about. Some of these measures are temporary, and we'll have to readjust our strategy as we move forward to a permanent cut.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance.
Thank you. I recognize Mr. Jordan. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Jarvis, you issued a memo on January 25th of this year, and, quote, the lateness of the implementation will intensify the effects of the sequester. So I want to go back to where Dr. Desjardins was. What was the date again when sequester was passed into law? August 2nd, 2011?
August 2nd, 2011.
Almost 20 months ago, or actually I think probably a full 20 months ago. So why did you have to wait until January? This is what Mr. Ferreira at the archives implemented a hiring freeze in 2011. Did you guys implement a hiring freeze in 2011?
We issued a memo in June of 2012.
Did you have a hiring freeze in 2011?
We did not have a hiring freeze at the time.
So you hired more people in 2011 after the sequester was enacted into law?
That's correct.
You did. Okay. Did you enact a hiring freeze in 2012?
We put a hiring control.
What's that mean?
That means that
did you hire more? Are there more people working now than there were before in 2012? Or did you hire?
There are less.
Less? No, in 2012. Did you have more people working later in 2012 than you had at the start of 2012?
I don't know the answer to that.
So we don't know if you had a hiring freeze or not?
No, we know we had a hiring control.
Okay, but I didn't ask that. I asked, did you have a hiring freeze?
We did not put a hiring freeze until January
2013. So in 2011 you didn't do a hiring freeze. 2012 you didn't do a hiring freeze. The archives decided to do one because they knew the law was the law on August 2nd, 2011. You didn't do that. Did you have bonuses in 2011?
Yes.
Did you have bonuses in 2012?
No, not yet.
Not yet? I mean, you're going to have some bonuses?
There are some required by law.
Okay. What about, did you have travel and conferences that you attended in 2011?
Very few.
But you did?
There were some, yes.
Okay. What about 2012?
Very few.
So you continued it in 2012?
Sir, the National Park Service...
Here's the point. Here's the point.
The National Park Service is a large geographic area.
The point is I ask the questions and you answer. Here's the point. The law was enacted August 2nd, 2011, 20 months ago. You issue a memo this January of 2013, say, oh, the lateness of sequester is going to cause us terrible things to happen, and yet you gave bonuses in 2011, potential bonuses in 2012. You hired more people in 2011. You can't tell me if you hired more people in 2012. You took conferences in 2000 and travel in 2011 and conferences and travel in 2012. And yet we have a gentleman right beside you who implemented a hiring freeze clear back in 2011 because he can plan and understands what might happen. All true.
The National Parks is a very different organization than archives.
Okay, let me do something here. We have, in my remaining 2 minutes, the White House, I want to know if this plan not to take action was driven by you or by the White House. So we have on the White House website, February of this year, it states relative to the national parks, many of the 398 national parks across the country would be partially or fully closed with shortened operating hours, closed facilities, reduced maintenance, and cuts to visitor services. Did the White House put that up? Did they consult with you before they put that up? Did you give them that information? Did you talk to someone at the White House? Tell me how that was put on the White House website.
I have no idea how that got on the White House website, but we did provide information about the impacts of sequestration through OMB.
So did you talk to anyone specifically at the White House about what may happen to the national parks?
No, sir, I did not.
You did not? But this sounds vaguely familiar to your statement on same January 25th, I assume maybe the same memo, where you said we expect the sequester, quote, will result in reductions to visitor services, hours of operation, shortening of season, and possibly the closing of areas during periods where there is insufficient staff to secure protection of visitors, employees, resources. It sounds pretty similar. So, but there was no coordination between you and the White House?
Not between me and the White House.
You didn't talk to anyone at the White House?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay. Did anyone on your staff communicate with White House officials about details and impacts of potential sequester?
No one on my staff.
Let me ask you this then, because I don't know where the blame has to go for lack of preparing. Let's look at what about this memo from Acting OMB Director Jeffrey Zeitz, who said, continue normal spending and operations. This was July 31st of last summer, 2012. Continue normal spending and operations since more than 5 months remain for Congress to act. Do you remember receiving that memo? Did that have an impact on your decisions not to reduce hiring, and not to reduce travel and conference attendance, and not to forego bonuses?
We did reduce travel. We did reduce conferences, and we put hiring controls on. So actually, we did get that memo, and we implemented a restriction across the board in the National Park Service planning for this.
Oh, but
we did not put a hiring freeze on until January.
But that's not. But this is communication from the White House that says continue normal things, and is it normal for? So what I'm trying to figure out is, when do you pay attention to the White House? When you don't? When do you plan ahead? When do you don't? Because this memo says keep doing the normal things, and it's pretty based on what you did in 2011. It's normal to give bonuses. It's normal to have travel and conferences, and it's normal not to have a hiring freeze. Is that right? And then here you got the OMB director saying continue normal spending and operations since more than 5 months remain for Congress to act. So you just told me you contradicted what the OMB director said. I mean, my first question, you said, no, we can't. I can't tell you whether we have a hiring control, not a hiring freeze, so you couldn't give me an answer. But now you're saying, no, we contradicted what the OMB director said. So I'm just trying to figure out, what did you guys do? Who did you listen to? How did you make your decisions?
What we decided to do is to be as conservative in our application of our budget and travel, supplies, and materials beginning in the middle of 12 in anticipation of the sequestration. Our paper will prove that to you, that we took a conservative approach to this from the very beginning, in spite of what OMB said. We knew that our responsibilities, that's an OMB memo that covers the entire government, we have to operate in the summer.
Respectfully, I think the American people might disagree, because as I said earlier, you have another director of an agency right beside you who decided to implement a hiring freeze in 2011. You had the opportunity to do the same. You chose not to. And now we have this contradiction based on what the White House OMB director had sent to you. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back, and I appreciate the extra time.
Thank the gentleman. Maybe a few parks closed in Ohio. But I recognize Mr. Harford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the benefit of being a new member is I get to actually listen to all of my colleagues and their concerns, and also the witnesses. And you know, it's been more than 100 days now since I've been here, and I, for the life of me, don't understand why we keep having these hearings that, to take my colleague's quote that he just said, I don't know where to place the blame or where the blame has to go. Why do we have to be in the blame game at all? Why can't we focus on what needs to be done to get our economy moving so that these cuts don't happen to begin with? You know, my constituents sent me here. I believe the majority of the American people want us to work together to solve problems and to avoid the harm that the sequester has caused. Now, I think it is critical that the public understand that this reprogramming authority is not some kind of unrestricted power that the agencies have to pick and choose which funding priorities, they want to make. And it is a highly limited authority. And claims that agency officials are not being straightforward with the public about their implementation of sequestration is simply not true. And I think it's the rhetoric and the gamesmanship and the brinksmanship of turning these hearings into something that they're not. I would rather work with the agencies to figure out what we need to do to benefit the public. So with the time I have remaining, I'd like to raise some concerns of constituents from my district as they relate to the National Park Service. A part of Lake Mead's 1.5 million acres lies in Nevada's 4th Congressional District, which is the 5th most visited national park unit last year with over 6.3 million visitors. Mr. Jarvis, you said that there's a 10-to-1 return on investment based on the work of our National Park Service. Now, it's my understanding that the Visitor Center at Lake Mead National Recreation Area will be closed 2 days a week now, and that the National Park Unit has braced for cuts in park security operations and efforts to curtail an invasive species, the quagga mussel, which is affecting the oxygen levels in the water, disrupting food chains, and causing damage to facilities. Mr. Jarvis, what efforts is the National Park Service undertaking to address issues like this that I imagine aren't just being affected at Lake Mead, but potentially at other national parks?
Well, as I indicated earlier, each of the individual national park units had to take the 5% cut at the park level. For Lake Mead National Recreation Area, that's an $889,000 cut to their operation halfway through the fiscal year. And there's no way you can take that kind of cut at a highly operational park like Lake Mead without having direct impacts on the operations. One of the key components here is that most of our parks operate at about 85 to 90% fixed costs. That means permanent salaries, utilities, fleet, just basic operations. And when you take a 5%, that hits the discretionary part of the budget, which is basically supplies, materials, and seasonal operations. So they are directly having impacts. We task the park to make decisions on what they can do. In terms of some of the key drivers in that area, such as quagga mussels, we are looking to use the fee accounts, and we have a request in the fiscal 14 budget specifically to improve overall our control on that invasive species.
Thank you. And I know my time is expiring, but I think in part if we could get some more information of what the additional cost could be based on the implementation of the sequestration. Again, this is an example of now if we cut back, it's actually going to cost us more in the long run, and that's a fool's choice, in my opinion, and on behalf of my constituents. And again, Mr. Chairman, I would hope that we can refocus our committee's efforts around solutions that will get our economy moving and less on the blame game between our Federal agencies. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming to testify today. And as we look at that, as my esteemed colleague opposite has just mentioned, you know, it's not about gamesmanship, but one of the problems that I get concerned about is that we've essentially made this into a game of rhetoric, placing false blame and false consequences at times, and that's what we're trying to get to. Mr. Ferrara, with regards to the National Archives, you and I both know that I've been there to see your operation. I want to compliment you on a job well done. And with that, and you didn't know that this was going on, but at that particular time, I asked you about sequestration and the effects of it on your agency, and you gave me a non-political response, which I appreciated. You said, we're managing through it. Obviously, any cuts are painful, but we're managing through it as a good manager would. And I want to thank you and go on record as thanking you for that type of response. We need to see more of that in Washington, D.C. With that being said, I would ask that you highlight perhaps two areas that you're most concerned about with regards to sequestration that we should address from a congressional standpoint.
Two that I would highlight: preservation. We're sitting on 12 billion pieces of our records and parchment paper, and deteriorating, and audiovisual materials that are deteriorating. So our ability to keep up with ensuring that they're going to be available for future generations is something that worries me. And the other thing is the investment needed in the Electronic Records Archive. We have moved from development into operations and maintenance, where we have the agencies on board in terms of delivering their records to us electronically, but there are some enhancements that have to be made to make it much more functional, and this is from input from the agencies who are using it.
Well, I thank you for that. And I can tell you, as one, I am more inclined when someone manages through these situations to look at the requests that they make in a more germane way as something that adds additional credence and credibility in terms of responses from that. Let me go on to Mr. Jarvis. With regards to the National Park Service, there's a thing here in Washington, D.C. that many times they call the Washington Monument Syndrome. Are you aware of that? And I think some of the heated rhetoric that you're hearing today is because that we are concerned that some of that Washington Monument Syndrome has crept into this sequestration, because even your staff, I believe, has told people that they're not sure that 99% of the visitors will even notice that there was a sequestration cut. And yet you've talked about trash collection, toilet paper, things like that. Would you say that those are things that people would notice?
I think they would notice. I notice it. Having worked almost 40 years for the National Park Service, I walked around the tidal basin during the middle of the Cherry Blossom Festival, and I noticed trash cans a little over full, and I noticed fewer rangers than would be normal for that kind of operation. So we don't want the public to notice it, because we take a great deal of pride in providing these places. We don't want to impact the public, so that's why we've concentrated the reductions on the shoulder seasons rather than in the center of our prime operation.
Well, and I'm glad that you said that, because in my district there are signs that have gone up that said we're closing operations, printed due to sequestration on permanent signs that have been placed in my district. Why would you say that that would have happened if indeed we were not trying to make a political statement?
I'm unaware of any signs.
I've got pictures. I'll be glad to share them with you.
I'd love to see them, and I would instruct the park to take those down.
Because I want to know how much we've spent on permanent signs that talk about sequestration. Yeah, and so I would ask that you respond to that
I think that's
after
inappropriate.
Okay. Are you aware personally of any conversations that have happened within the National Park Service or DOI that have talked about making sequestration as painful as possible?
No, sir. We did not want to make this painful.
I know you didn't want to. Are you aware of any conversations that have taken place where making cuts painful has been discussed. Let me tell you the reason why I asked was because I've talked to some Park Service employees who have indicated that they were told that the cuts coming down would be painful, and that came from management. And I was saying, well, I understand that they won't be painful, that we're going to manage our way through this, but yet somehow they got the impression from people within your organization that they would be painful. So you're not aware of any conversations or any memos or anything discussing that?
I am not, but I want to make a distinction here. There's a difference between intentionally making them painful or the fact that they will be painful. The Park Service is an operational organization. We are not a grant-making organization. We run parks. And so a cut of this level is painful by definition. We have worked to try to minimize that pain, but I will tell you that we have not instructed anyone to intentionally make this painful to the public.
Okay. Okay, I can see my time's out. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from Virginia for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could my time start at 5, please?
Well, I thought we were going to give you as much time.
Oh, great. You're going to give me, okay.
But the gentleman requested, so please read time.
No, I stand corrected by the Chairman. First of all, let me thank all three of you for managing through a very difficult and mindless budgeting exercise, but real nonetheless. All three of you represent revered institutions, respected and very much beloved by the public. And in listening to this hearing, as I have, you would all be forgiven for feeling you find yourself in the midst of a Kafkaesque scenario. I myself can't quite follow the logic of some of my colleagues. Sequester should be blamed on President Obama. It was his idea. Really, because I seem to recall the President wanting a clean debt ceiling vote in August of 2011, and for the first time in history he was denied it, and for the first time in history our credit rating went down. It was not the President's idea. We created a super committee doomed to failure because half the members of that committee would not even entertain a discussion of revenue. You should have known about sequestration. Should have been planning for it all along. You should have known we meant it. How are you supposed to know that? Like this Congress or the previous Congress have been consistent in their economic message? Really? About the fiscal cliff? About the Bush taxes? About sequestration? About the debt ceiling? About nothing. And oh, by the way, had you anticipated that we were serious all along, what were you to do with the fact that the majority, which says it addressed sequestration not once but twice, their answer was to eliminate all the cuts on the defense and national security side and double down on the domestic discretionary side. So in other words, the sequestration you are now wrestling with would have been double. Somehow, you should have fathomed that. You should have divined what we actually would do and how irresponsible and reckless we would become. I don't share that view. I think you're being asked to deal with something unprecedented and not responsible. And by the way, Mr. Jarvis, don't give away those signs too fast. I think you should put up those signs, and I'll help you put them up in every national park in this country. I'll even help paint them. The public should know what's happening. The public should not be shielded from the fact that there are consequences from sequestration that are real. And that's the other thing that's so puzzling. Last summer, maybe it was because it was before an election, the message from my friends on the other side of the aisle, I was with them on platforms, was the earth is going to open and swallow us all if sequestration is allowed to happen. Now, apparently, the message is you know, we ought to soft pedal it. Don't be scaring people. The consequences are all absorbable. They're not real. They won't have real consequences in real people's lives. And from everything I can see and everything I hear, I think the three of you are attempting to manage and minimize the damage. Isn't that what you're asked to do as a manager? Mr. Jarvis, in the national parks, we charge entrance fees and other fees if, because of furloughs or letting positions stay vacant as you're managing to, might it require some parks, I'm thinking of one in my district, the Prince William County Forest Park, they're looking at perhaps having to close for 1 day a week or maybe even a little bit more. But when they do, they also lose revenue. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
Have you estimated the potential loss of revenue in the National Park Service, sort of writ large?
We have not estimated that, but we do anticipate some loss of revenue.
So, because you talked about bringing in roughly $160 million a year in revenue, some percentage of that is going to be lost.
Yes, sir.
So, and that's over and above the cuts from sequestration. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ferraro, my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, was citing you as a paragon of virtue in anticipating sequestration and how poor Mr. Jarvis should have followed your model. Would you agree with Mr. Jarvis that the missions of the two organizations are quite different, and therefore the challenges sequestration poses are also quite different?
I agree that they're different organizations, but let me put it in perspective. I came to Washington from the New York Public Library. I was responsible for 91 facilities, reporting to the mayor and the city council. So I have 5 years of experience in trimming budgets and making do with few resources.
And, Mr. Chairman, can I just ask one more question? Or?
I wasn't going to stop you. You're on a roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Although I am informed that, and I believe it's true, that the revenues go to the general fund. They do not.
No.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One final question, because it's sort of hanging out there, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer it. Did you receive any instructions from the administration, OMB, the White House, to either soft pedal the impacts of sequestration or to, in fact, magnify them for some political purpose as you were trying to wade through the consequences and how you would manage those consequences?
No.
Mr. Ferraro?
No.
You're under oath.
I'm under oath.
Mr. Jarvis?
No, sir.
You're under oath.
No, sir.
Dr. Clough?
No.
You're under oath. I thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Just for the record, would that be true of anybody from any source within government equally?
Yes, as far as I know.
Nobody in government, nobody in the Department of Interior, no Deputy Assistant Secretary of Hoopla, nobody?
No, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, could I just clarify one thing? Mrs. Norton, at one point in her questioning, I think suggested that the National Public Park Service was 1/14 of the Federal Government budget. I think the actual statistic
It's like 1/140th.
Yeah, exactly, 1/14 of 1% of the Federal Government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So noted for the record. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lankford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here and for all of your service and for what you do for our country. I can tell you it wasn't that long ago that I was walking through the National Archives and standing there with my daughters who just kept repeating over and over again, it's right there. It's right there. The children of today need to be able to see and experience what's happening at the Smithsonian, at the National Archives, and our national parks. It's a significant part of what we do as Americans as we pass on our heritage on. So this is important for all of us. So I congratulate all of you for what you're doing on a day-to-day basis for the children and for our families. And I encourage you to continue going. I am extremely aware, as everyone else is, with our staff and with every staff across the Federal Government, that this is difficult budget times. We get that. But I thank you for what you're doing for the nation and for the future on this. Mr. Vieira, when did you start planning for sequestration and start thinking about its effects and what could occur?
We actually started in September of 2011 by reducing employee recruitment, retention, and relocation incentives. And then in November of that year, we instituted the hiring freeze. In February 2012, we returned underutilized leases to GSA. In May of 2012, we returned underutilized motor vehicles to GSA. In August of 2012 and again in March of 2013, we reduced travel budgets by 41% below fiscal year 2010 levels. In September 2012, we focused available resources on one-time investments that would permanently reduce operating costs like building energy efficiency. And in March 2013, we reduced NARA-sponsored conferences and instituted procedures to apply increased scrutiny to all conferences.
But that means that you walked in, and you've been in leadership there how long?
Just over 3 years.
So you walked in your first year, got the lay of the land, and could see some areas, and then begin to implement some areas to be more efficient in the process.
With the guidance of our new Chief Financial Officer.
Okay.
That's right.
That's a lot of work to take that on. To take on that kind of change, it's a lot of pushback that occurs from that. But you planned ahead, and because of that, we're able to be more efficient and continue operations on it. Mr. Jarvis, when did you start planning for the effects of sequestration?
Officially with the memo on June 13, 2012.
Okay. And then started implementing ideas of what to be able to do to actually save money starting when?
Well, we instructed in 2012 in June in that memo that every park and program would implement what we call our budget cost projection model in anticipation of a 5% reduction, and looking at every aspect of their operation, travel, fleet, awards, all of those components, and really restricting them from doing any type of movement between accounts, reduction in number of seasonals. One of the things about park operations is there's a flow into the falls after the end of the fiscal year, and some parks actually carry those seasonal operations into the fall. We asked them to significantly restrict that so that they could have some discretionary funds going into 2013.
Now, you also mentioned before that each one of your parks, you gave them some sort of responsibility to start looking for savings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
When did that occur?
Well, we began, as I indicated, in the June 13, 2012, and then specifically in January of 2013, we asked each park to produce an actual plan for how they would implement the sequestration.
So the park's first notification of this, back to the park level, wasn't until sequestration was actually imminent, was on top of it. So that some of the advanced planning was in leadership in June, and then the parks actually got it. What instructions did they get when they were told, to start thinking about where they could pare back? Was there some guidance that was given to them?
Yes. Again, actually, it's in the June memo of 2012. We asked specifically each park had to follow their budget cost projection models that looked at all of these reductions. We didn't come down with a hard enforcement on those restrictions until January of 2013.
Okay. So they were given instructions then in June to start thinking through that, some sort of guidance document that was set down on that. Dr. Clough, what about you? When did you all start preparing for the effects of sequestration?
Well, we started planning for the possibility of budget cuts several years ago, and we started the program called Smithsonian Redesign to become as efficient as we could with the present resources that we had. We're still implementing that. We used the services of McKinsey & Associates to get us started. We've now implemented that internally. We've tried to implement best practices as quickly as we can through a process that we have now for sharing information from our units. Anybody can have a best practice. We have employees who work in Panama, and so we look to across the institution for best ideas and for best practice sharing. I mentioned the process of digitization for us is a big money saver. It's an inventory control device in addition to creating access for people, but it's a tremendous tool for us to save wear and tear on collections and cut down on the number of people that you need to maintain your collections.
Okay.
So we've been working on it, generally speaking. We have a menu of options that we already had in place before sequestration ever got on the horizon as to how we would accept different types of budget cuts and different options for us.
So you already run a contingency plan already in place?
We had those already in place, and when sequester became clear, then we implemented a series of those actions that we thought would take care of this year's problem. We do have a unique 2-year budget process, and it allows us to do a little carrying over. So we put in some restrictions back in 2012 that would help us in 2013 if sequester appeared.
Okay. Thank you for that. And by the way, that's also a statement. I'm a proponent of a 2-year budgeting cycle for all the agencies to provide more flexibility, and that's a different topic for a different day. So I appreciate that very much. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank you, Chairman. As you know, Chairman, we have some of the most beautiful national parks in my congressional district in the state of Utah, obviously.
Would the gentleman care to name a few of them?
Yes. As a matter of fact, Chairman, I'm prepared to name that, of course, Arches and Canyonlands among 2 of the 5 that we so readily tout out west in Utah. So, Mr. Jarvis, we thank you for your service. You've been engaged with the Park Service for decades, and we do appreciate your service. I do want to ask about a couple of the expense items that you have to deal with, the consequence. I mean, you have 84 million acres, which is an awful lot of land to cover. Can you talk to me a little bit about the number of vehicles that you have, maybe the miles that you have to travel? Do you have a sense of that right off the top of your head? I know it's been a long morning.
Well, I think that often people don't understand about the National Park Service. I mean, with my colleagues here, Archives has the the Declaration of Independence, but I have Independence Hall, and the Smithsonian has Old Glory, but I have Fort McHenry, and the responsibilities for their maintenance and care is different. The National Park Service has an inventory of facilities second only to the Department of Defense, and most of those are historic. We have thousands of miles of road and thousands of facilities and 279 million visitors a year. So the challenges that we have in terms of keeping those things operational are difficult. We are also geographically in every state in the Union, from the Virgin Islands to the far Pacific. And the requirement are vehicles, aircraft, firefighting vehicles, and the like. I don't know how many vehicles we have, but I can get you those numbers.
And Mr. Chairman, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that when the price of fuel over the last 4 years has doubled, there's a dramatic impact, not only to the United States Postal Service, which I believe the estimate is that for every penny increase in the cost of fuel, it costs $9 million more. And my guess that there are similar types of effects and consequences when this nation doesn't have an energy plan and that we have such rapidly rising costs of fuel. It literally has doubled. I also concerned, Chairman, that last time I looked, and it may be for the Department of Interior, not just the Park Service, Chairman, but that we had some billion, I think it was close to $1 billion in backlog of ongoing maintenance and other types of programs that are out there. Do you have a specific number that if you would, implement, how much is that? How many different systems are there in place or that you're trying to have implemented to do this maintenance?
The maintenance backlog is $11 billion. And in order to maintain those facilities at a base level, I would need at least $700 million a year. I get about $300.
So my point, Chairman, is this Congress has historically allocated money for acquisition of additional lands. In fact, if you go back and look from the 1970s, not just within the Park Service, but the Federal Government has acquired private property and made it public property greater than the size of Arizona. We can't maintain what we currently have. In fact, it's not even close to what we're trying to maintain. And I guess there are those of us that believe that let's take care of the treasures and the jewels that we have rather than be on this kick to continue to add private property and make it public property. I'd also believe, Chairman, that there is public property out there, particularly at the BLM, not so much the Park Service, but at the BLM, that serves no public purpose. It's not there for mineral rights. It doesn't take, in fact, in 1997, the Clinton administration did a study. And I introduced a bill that said, this 1% of public property that serves no public purpose, let's sell it back. Let's make it private property. We can't even maintain what we have now. The Park Service is telling us they've got $11 billion that they recommend we do in maintenance to make sure that we protect these treasures. Next time somebody steps forward and says, you know what, we need to acquire more, we need to implement the Antiquities Act, because we need to do another, we can't afford to do what we're doing now. And that's one of my concerns, is that we continue to do this. And lastly, Mr. Jarvis, again, my understanding is from fiscal year 2003 to fiscal year 2011, the operational National Park System, the ONPS budget, the operation of the National Park Service budget, which is roughly, according to my notes, 86.7% of your account, that's increased 11.8% from 2003 to 2012, 7.4% faster than inflation. And yet, over the last 4 years, our visitors are still down from the peak that happened in 2009 of 285 million visitors. So, you know, when we're asking for a modest 5% cut and we bring that down, and the number of visitors is down from 4 years ago, I don't think that's an unreasonable place to be. Do you care to comment on that, Mr. Jarvis?
Well, visitation depends on a lot of factors: gas prices, price of flights to Europe, marketing, a lot of factors. 279 million versus 285 million. It goes up and down. You know, the visitor centers and facilities are open for the American public, and if it changes a couple of percentage points, we do believe, though, there is an investment we need to make in the national parks for the next century, for the next communities, for the next crop of Americans, and we think it's a good investment.
Well, thank you. Again, thank you for your service, and again, Chairman, I will be one that advocate that we invest in the jewels that we've already set aside. Let's take care of those. Let's do the maintenance on those, rather than whetting our appetites to acquire more and more and more. Let's take care of what we have here. I appreciate your time and service, and thank you for participation in the hearing. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Jarvis, the gentleman from Utah made a pretty important point. How much of your acquisition fund would you choose to transfer if you had the authority to transfer it to operation? And you're obviously new construction and land acquisition.
Well, we basically have a moratorium on new construction. Our construction budget is really only going to deferred maintenance at this point.
Let me ask a question. If in constant dollars your operational account is greater by about 5% after sequestration than it was in 2008, what happened that your costs went up faster than inflation for operation?
Well, I would disagree that our budget is up 5%.
Well, it's up 13% before sequestration in constant dollars, according to the figures that I have in front of me, which you have in front of you.
Well, according to my figures, we're down about 4% since 2010.
You're speaking total budget, and I'm concentrating on operation. Because they're bifurcated in sequestration, let's start with operation. Operations where toilet paper comes out of. So it's also where grooming the trails. It's also where those personnel that lead the trips and so on, all that comes out of it. That's up 13% in constant dollars, adjusted for inflation from 2003 through 2008 through today. The base on that was 2003. You gave us the figures. We read the figures. We'd like to know the answer of why, with more money in constant dollars for operation than you had on the day President George W. Bush left office, you cannot operate with less visitors as well as the American people, who for the most part are old enough to remember way back in 2008, what it was like to go through the parks.
The increases that we've received, as I remember since that period, have come in specific categories, one which is fire. The National Park Service, along with our fellow land management agencies, have a responsibility for wildland fire. We are receiving a great deal of growth in our fire responsibilities across the country, and those are not dollars that can translate into cutting grass or keeping the restrooms open. Our fixed costs have gone up, and in 2009—
Well, let's talk about fixed cost.
Yes, sir.
Inflation indexes are designed to pick up most fixed cost. What are your fixed costs that went up more than my constituents who are watching this on C-SPAN? What is it that went up more than inflation for the rest of America in your cost? Was it your labor rate? Did it go up faster than inflation?
In some places, labor rates go up.
No. Mr. Jarvis, one of the things about this committee is we like the answers to the questions we asked. Overall, did your employees earn more than the rate of inflation, such that in constant dollars they are making more today than they made in 2003 or 2008 or previous years? Did their real pay go up faster than inflation?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. I'd appreciate it if you'd answer that one for the record. You know, one of the challenges we have on this committee is we're well aware that all three of you are dealing with discretionary funds. As a result, you're dealing with the tip of the iceberg, not the base that's underwater that's going to sink the ship of state, to use plenty of metaphors here for a moment. It's one of the challenges I have is I'm talking to you about that which we can control, what sequestration affected. I'm very aware that until this year, when the President proposed reindexing or changing the index rate on Social Security, we didn't have a partner even beginning to touch entitlement. We now have that. So I am limited here. Let me ask some questions from a standpoint of the National Archives. You take both paper and electronic data to this day from agencies around government, right?
That's right.
Isn't it true that if those who are delivering you material did a better job of preparing it in the least expensive format, both to receive and archive, you would be able to have great cost savings and the public would have better digital searching capability?
And that's the thrust of the Government Records Directive. Yes, that's true.
So, touting a piece of legislation that I believe in that did not pass out of the Senate, which is not an uncommon thing for all those of us in the House to do, the Data Act, which could also be called the Structured Data Act, that would create structured data so that all reports, all data coming in from the government would ultimately be interoperable and searchable. How would that affect your ability to both maintain archives and provide meaningful information, both on the Presidential Records Act side and obviously for all government information, including from those of us in Congress?
In theory, it sounds terrific. It's the details, how it would actually be implemented.
Well, let's go through that for a moment because no one else is seeking time real badly right now. The gentleman will get his time to talk more about those 5 parks in just a moment. If we implement it the way you would like it implemented, what does it do both for cost and availability to the public of the kinds of information they believe or that potentially, rightfully or wrongfully, they want?
I think any time in an IT environment where you establish standards across the government, it's much more efficient and effective, and it improves potential access at the other end.
Thank you. Dr. Clough, in your case, you know, except for not charging for admission when other museums around the country do, except for not charging for the Washington Zoo, well, the San Diego Zoo has to, except for having a hard time asking people to give you money because they assume we'll give you the money we need, is there anything we can do to help you?
Well, I think the comment that was made by David applies to us as well. Collections care is a critical item for us. I can get donors to support new construction in many cases. I can get donors to support new and exciting initiatives. But it's much tougher to get the basics, and collections care is an essential one for us. Sort of in a similar category as maintenance. I'm a civil engineer by training. You don't want to build up a deferred maintenance backlog if you can avoid it. And the longer it goes on, the worse it gets. So I think those are sort of the basic things that government can help us do that we really can't do ourselves.
Let me ask you a tough question. Roughly 97%, 98% of the things you have are not on display at any given time. Isn't that true?
Yes, that's correct. In the museums. Now, we do have a major loan program. 5 million of our objects are shared with our affiliate museums and others around the country, and digitally. Now we have about 1 million of our objects up with images and about 8 million with records. And so we're sharing more and more of them digitally.
Well, I want to talk about sharing because as a former businessman, I know that when you share, you don't bear the cost of transporting the item back and forth. But what do you see as the potential revenue of some of that 97% that's sitting in storage that we're paying to store being made available through other museums, but also the potential for it to equal or exceed its total cost of preserving?
Well, that's a little bit of a tough thing. I think that obviously these are a lot of our collections are scientific collections. 127 million of our 137 are what we would call scientific.
And I do not have the time to look at every insect that you have preserved, but I understand it's unmatchable anywhere in the world.
It is, and I haven't counted them all myself. But I would say it's important to realize that the collections are used for research by a number of government agencies. And to the Park Service credit, we signed an agreement recently to share collections expertise and to do everything we can to prevent overlap and work together on that. We'll do more of that in the future. But the Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture actively uses our collections for entomological reasons, for spread of disease. NIH uses them for spread of disease from animals and insects and so on.
Now, did they come to you because you're free rather than somebody else who might charge them big bucks because they're the government?
Well, that's because they're a Federal agency, and we collaborate with our fellow Federal. Now, anyone who wants to use the collections for research, if it's a legitimate reason, they have access to the collection.
Okay. So, but do you see the potential for some revenue from the treasure trove you have? Obviously, the intergovernment one, we could have a separate discussion, but non-intergovernment.
I think if there is a potential, it's in the digital realm, and where we put value added against the collections as opposed to just making them available in sort of a generic sense. But if we package them in certain ways, those things are marketable. And we are looking at those options where we could actually market packages that would make sense in a normal run of business to do that.
Okay. Last question, Mr. Jarvis. Do you need any authority to raise more revenue that you get to keep under the 1990, was it 97 or 94 Act, 97 Act?
Well, the fee authorization legislation is up for reauthorization in 2014. We do think that there are some appropriate changes to that would give us more authority, change some of the structures, and let's say liberalize how the fees could be used. We were not able to use the fee funding to cover these costs because we did not have transfer authority. So there are some fixes. I think if the sequestration continues, we are going to need VSIP and VERA authority, early buyout, and early out authorities to deal with it in the next fiscal year.
Well, great. I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Utah. He's going to come up and sit here and end this. Mr. Jarvis, I was tough on you on the way in. Clearly, the ranking member was also tough. Hopefully, the people at Interior recognize that you were just the messenger, and they will deliver the documents we both asked for. Now I recognize the gentleman from Utah.